Who would win in a fight, Pro Tools or Studio One? Disclaimer, I'm a Studio One guy, but before I was a Studio One guy, I was a Pro Tools guy. And I became a Studio One guy before I ever did any work for and with personas, so I have a pretty good perspective on both, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we dive in, if you'd like to know more of my gear recommendations other than just software, I've got a free guide that you can have. Just go to recordingrevolution.com/gear, enter your email to have that for free. So the first category we can talk about is ubiquity. Which one, if you were just to run out into the wild, which DAW would you see first, Pro Tools or Studio One? The answer to that, and the winner in this category, is certainly Pro Tools. In a lot of ways, it is still the industry standard, especially if you're going to be a professional engineer or producer in a town like Nashville, where I live. You're going to need to know, have, and run Pro Tools, or at least have that as a part of your skill set, because any major studio you walk into is most likely going to be running a Pro Tools rig, and if a producer hires you to do some pocketing on a drum session, they're probably just going to send you Pro Tools files, so you'll need a way to open those up and work on them. So it makes sense to have Pro Tools as a part of your overarching skill set, if not your primary DAW. However, for us home studio folks, like you and me, do we have to have the industry standard to make great music? Well, you know the answer to that. Of course not. In fact, there was an EP I did a few years ago where I was in Studio One, the keyboard player was in Pro Tools, the drummer was in Digital Performer, the bass player was in Record, right? Yeah. And then I feel like there was one other, but at least 4 different DAWs. They went to 4 different studios, and the album turned out wonderful. Why? Because it's just audio files, right? We're just sending wave files back and forth. It's super simple to do. It's not overly complicated. And in fact, it's my preferred method of working. Even if you and I have the same version of Studio One, a lot of times I'd rather us just send like raw wave files that begin at bar 0 back and forth to one another, so we're not having to play that game of, oh, do I have the same plugins you do, blah, blah, blah. We're just sending the raw goods back and forth, almost like mailing a reel of tape to your studio, then you mail it back to me. It's that kind of a workflow, and it still works incredibly well. I don't see any downsides. So if I'm working with someone, collaborating with someone, and they're on Pro Tools and I'm on Studio One, I literally don't care, because we can make plenty of great music together. I know because I've done it so many times. Let's talk about the second category, my personal favorite, the actual workflow of the software itself. I cut my teeth on Pro Tools when I was getting an audio degree in college. Pro Tools was the thing that we learned. I got really good and really fast at Pro Tools, and I made a lot of music in Pro Tools. When I started tinkering with Studio One back when it was on version 2, it's on version 6 now, there was a big learning curve. It was just very different. And at first I didn't like it. But then the more I started to use it and learn how it was designed, how the workflow was meant to go in Studio One, I slowly started to like it more and more. So for example, editing. Pro Tools is a phenomenal editor. I used to love getting in and like pocketing drums, where you tighten everything up and you can either use Beat Detective or you can go through and do it manually. I was really good at it, really fast at it. Then I discovered Studio One. Once I learned its workflow, I don't edit like I did in Pro Tools anymore. I edit differently, and I'm able to do it even faster. For example, if I need to fix a beat that's not quite in time, I don't have to like cut it, slide it over, and then drag the ends out and then crossfade it. I just do a certain key command and the audio slides where it needs to be, but the endpoints stay in place. Then I press another button and it does crossfades on both sides, and I can move on. It's little things like that. When I show Pro Tools people that specific tip, they always go, whoa, like it's wild to me, because it's a very simple technique, but it works super well and has transformed the way that I record and do just my normal workflow stuff. Same thing with comping vocals. If I select a bunch of different parts from a bunch of different takes, Studio One creates the comp, and it also crossfades everything for me because it just intuitively knows that's something I'm gonna want to do. When it comes to mixing, I love mixing on both platforms. Studio One really won me over with things like, if I just press the S button on my keyboard, it solos the channel that I'm listening to. If I want to hear everything that's feeding my drum bus, I just press solo on the drum bus and it automatically solos all the channels feeding the drum bus and also any effects that these channels are sending to. It's not like earth-shattering feature set, but it made my life easier, and it just made sense. This is how I want it to work. Multiply that experience times about 1,000 other things, and that's what slowly won me over to Studio One over the years. Probably one of the biggest pieces is the mastering inside of Studio One. It has its own mastering suite, its own mastering page. So when I'm done mixing a song, I hit a button, it renders that mix, drops it into a mastering page. Now the two are synced up, so if I change the mix later, it'll update it in the mastering page. But then the mastering page has all the stuff you'd expect from a mastering suite. You don't need another piece of software to do your mastering. You can do it all right here, including all the metering that you need, the ability to export things like DDP and all those other formats. It's all built in to Studio One as a complete suite of software. Let's talk about responsiveness. Studio One, in my opinion, one of the things that really won me over, above all the things I've already mentioned, was the fact that they, as a company, were responsive. There was a little feature I wanted to see when I had like my tom drums routed to my drum bus. If I created a bus for the toms, because I wanted to just run them to a toms bus, if I did that and created a bus, that bus, by default, would be routed to the main output, not to my drum bus. And I thought that doesn't make any sense. It should go wherever the toms were going before. So I emailed one of the people at ProTools Software, which is based in Germany, by the way, and they said that's a great idea. In the very next update, I want to say it was days later, that was changed and fixed. Now, of course, you can't please everybody all the time. There are things that people complain about with both Pro Tools and Studio One. A big one with Studio One right now is that there's no Atmos support. I know Pro Tools has gotten a lot of heat over the years with the way it's gone about doing its subscription model and things like that, and the cost of upgrades and keeping your system working. They're a bigger company, and a lot of that means they've done a lot of things really well, but it also means that some of the feedback from their users, especially even like their big name users here in places like here in Nashville, doesn't seem to reach the ears of the people that it needs to. So Pro Tools wins the Ubiquity Award. It's everywhere. But Studio One, for me, wins the Workflow and the Responsiveness Award. Okay, so you've made it this far in the video. Let me give you my best piece of advice when it comes to things like this, like software, hardware, these hand-wringing, gut-wrenching decisions. It doesn't really matter. Yes, I would love it if you use Studio One, but I really, for the most part, I just don't care. I know my personas people probably hate that I said that, but I would much rather you use whatever you have right now and make great sounding music. If you can't make great sounding music with the equipment that you have now, it's probably not the equipment, and it's certainly probably not the software. So find a piece of software that makes sense to you, one that you connect with. If you need lots of software to do that, I guess that's fine. I would rather you just pick one and stick with it, learn it inside out, because in the end of the day, they all kind of do the same thing. They all record and mix and edit and export music. So don't let your focus on the tools distract you too much from the real focus, which is making music, building a body of work, doing this thing that you love, which is music production and music creation. And by the way, Graham Cochran and I have had students who use every piece of software you can imagine going through our courses and trainings. So you don't have to be using what we use to get a whole lot of value out of what we teach. Just like I can teach you a guitar riff on my Gibson, and if you're playing a Fender, guess what? You can learn that riff just as well. So if you're using Logic or Reaper or any of the other DAWs that I didn't mention that people are going to be mad about not mentioning, it really doesn't matter, because the stuff I do in Studio One, you can do in Pro Tools or whatever system that you're using. So raise your awareness up a level and realize that no matter what software is out there, you can learn from people, because we're teaching you the art of making music, not how to run a piece of software. And by the way, I mentioned this earlier, but if you'd like to hear more of my recommendations for equipment that I enjoy, that I own, that I use, I've put together a gear guide. You can download that at recordingrevolution.com/gear. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.